borrowed power, a term which has become ubiquitous with modern World of Warcraft. When exactly did the trend of borrowed power become so prevalent, and why does Blizzard keep doing it if there's obviously a lot of very negative feedback every time they add in a new system? First, let's go all the way back to vanilla WoW. Let's examine the first ever borrowed power system. A borrowed power system, in the most simplest terms, is when you obtain something that increases the power level of your character, which you have to go out of your way to obtain, that you can only realistically keep for a limited amount of time, usually for less than an expansion. Technically, all gear is borrowed power, but that's also the backbone of so many RPGs that it's obviously not what we're talking about here. But tier set bonuses, a specific kind of gear, does fall squarely into the borrowed power definition. The tier set bonuses, more specifically the raid set bonuses, give your characters incredibly specific upgrades based on acquiring enough pieces of equipment. And some of them are pretty minor things, like just reducing the mana cost of your totems, or giving you more hit chance on your taunt ability. However, some of them were so good and fixed a core part of the class that they were just added to the class later on. Like the Shaman's Tier 3 8 set bonus, which gave your Lightning Shield the ability to grant you 15 mana per 5 seconds while it was active. Blizzard and players liked this so much that they literally added it as an ability in the next expansion called Water Shield, which basically functioned the same way as that tier set bonus. In Dragon Soul, the 2 set bonus for hunters doubled the amount of focus that their basic attacks generated, which felt so good for the hunter playstyle that it was added as a baseline feature to the class in the next expansion. The tier 15 2-set bonus for rogues allowed their finishing moves to work as if they'd consumed 6 combo points, which was added as a talent later on because players liked the implications of it. And there's many more examples of tier set bonuses changing the class in a fundamental way that was so well liked, it was eventually added to the class later on, after the borrowed power system was no longer current content. Because these effects are tied to gear, they are very limited on how long they can be used for, by the maximum item level of those pieces of equipment. There are some expansions in which tier set bonuses were so good that it kept being used all the way until the end of the expansion and had to be nerfed so that people would stop using them once their item level was no longer valid, like the Shaman Tier 12 2-set bonus, which had a chance to reset the cooldown on your fire elemental. Although for the most part, players like tier set bonuses. You have to work hard in order to obtain them from the current raid tier. Most of them will fundamentally change how some of your classes will play during that raid tier. And if your tier set bonus doesn't really do anything special for you, you're probably going to have another one waiting for you in the next raid tier. And at the very least, it'll provide some kind of static DPS or healing benefit. But it does the ever important thing of occasionally changing how you play your class. Like the 2-set bonus back in Nighthold, which allowed you to spam Void Bolts for a few seconds when you entered Void form on a Shadow Priest, which put me in the habit of spamming the Void Bolt button every time I entered Void form because I just got used to it. Quick, simple systems you obtain with a new season of content, which sometimes have fun and exciting effects. And we wouldn't really get another borrowed power system until Wrath of the Lich King. In Wrath of the Lich King, they introduced the Inscription profession, which added a whole bunch of glyphs to the game, which were consumable items that increased the power level of your character. Now, glyphs don't really count as a borrowed power system in the same way as tier set bonuses, because glyphs lasted as a power increase for 4 expansions. But they were incredibly influential to modern borrowed power systems, so it's worth looking over them. In the original form of glyphs, they were basically consumable items that you would socket into your character, kind of like how you would socket a gem into a piece of equipment. If you wanted to have a new glyph, you'd have to go out and buy the glyph from the auction house in order to overwrite one of the current ones you already had. And the glyphs were incredibly influential. Like the ability to cast Penance while moving was a feature of the ability that was provided by a glyph, which is just a baseline feature of how the ability works today. Then glyphs went under a few changes over the years, and in Cataclysm they added an extra row of glyphs, allowed them to be permanent, so you no longer had to buy a new one every time you wanted to change one out, and then they slowly stripped power from the glyphs over time, until they removed all glyphs which could increase the power level of your character in Legion. So now glyphs still exist in the game, but purely as a cosmetic. And since glyphs were pretty easy to just add to the game, and people could obtain them, and more importantly, people were used to Blizzard changing how glyphs functioned every expansion, it was the perfect playground for Blizzard to experiment with adding new minor features to classes. Let's take a look at the glyph of Deep Freeze, for example. In its original form, it just increased the range of Deep Freeze by 10 yards. Then it was changed to increase the damage of Frostbolt on a target under the effects of Deep Freeze by 20%, where it was then changed again to instead just increase the damage of Deep Freeze by 20% when used against stun immune targets. It was then removed and replaced with Glyph of Ice Barrier, before being re-added to the game and simply removed the global cooldown from Deep Freeze at the cost of reducing its duration by 1 second, before finally being removed from the game permanently in Legion when they removed all of the major glyphs. So it was literally the same glyph for all of those expansions, but it changed functionality completely between all of those expansions, and only really shared the distinction that it affected Deep Freeze in some way. And this was an incredibly common scenario with glyphs and how they affected abilities. They would routinely change how a glyph worked with an ability, that people were completely used to glyphs changing every expansion, and in fact, looked forward to see if they were going to make some underperforming glyphs more powerful, or worried if a powerful glyph might get nerfed into uselessness. However, let's put glyphs on hold for now. Let's jump over to Mists of Pandaria. Mists of Pandaria is when they added a new borrowed power system, which would last for the entire expansion, except it was done in a way which was tied to gear directly. And that was the Legendary Cloak and the associated questline. The Legendary Cloak was a piece of equipment that you work all expansion in order to build, which required you to farm out a lot of materials and reputation, as well as complete a whole bunch of quests that involved doing raids. And the entire process was time-gated, where you literally could not complete the quest until the last raid tier, where the final quest would unlock that allowed you to finally upgrade your cloak to legendary quality. However, throughout the expansion, you would get a high item level cloak, as well as other bonuses which directly increase the power level of your character as well. And the whole process of acquiring the legendary cloak is very familiar to the progression systems we have in modern borrowed power systems. At the beginning of the expansion, the first tier bosses would drop shot-touched weapons, which could be socketed with crystallized shot-touched gems, which were basically just a higher statted regular gems with legendary quality. But continuing the legendary cloak questline would allow you to unlock the Eye of the Black Prince, which allowed you to add an extra socket to your shot-touched weapons, although only with a normal gem. Then later on you would unlock the legendary meta gems, which had actually significant effects tied to them, like giving you a mini Bloodlust haste buff randomly as a proc. And then finally you'd end off the expansion with the legendary cloak, which of course had really strong effects for every spec. And the legendary cloak was somewhat successful, so they did it again in Warlords of Draenor. In WoD, they had the legendary ring and Draenor perks. The legendary ring wasn't as generous with giving out extra items along the way. You basically just upgraded a ring, which made it stronger and stronger, which wasn't really a new thing since they'd done something similar in classic TBC and Wrath, except at the end of the expansion you got a super strong legendary ring, as well as a legendary follower. The other borrowed power system they had in Warlords of Draenor were the Draenor perks, which were just something you got while leveling up, and they vastly impacted the power level of your character. But that has got to be the most simplest power up they've ever given players for a new expansion, as most people probably forgot they even got them while leveling up, because you just got them all automatically by the time you hit max level. Then let's head over to Legion, and we have the very first modern borrow power system, that is the artifact weapon. And people love the artifact weapon. Each one had a whole bunch of major lore tied to it, vastly increased the power level of your character in more specific ways than just a generic ring or cloak. And you got to level up the weapon like you did your character, with artifact power instead of experience points. In addition, Legion also had their own set of legendaries, which were also incredibly powerful. Some of them on the same tier are even better than the cloak or ring from the previous two expansions. And these legendaries you just got randomly by doing whatever. And legendaries definitely had a much more mixed reaction. Generally, people liked the legendaries, they just hated how you obtained them. And as the expansion went on, they would just add more of the power to the artifact weapon, giving it more traits and even an additional way to customize it with the crucible. And then at the end of the expansion, they made the artifact no longer work, and you were incredibly depowered for the next expansion. Then in Battle for Azeroth, they removed tier set bonuses, added in Azerite traits, which were like a worse version of tier set bonuses, in addition to essences, benthic gear, and then finally corruptions at the end of the expansion. Then in Shadowlands, they have covenants, conduits, legendaries, and domination shards. And pretty much every single one of these has been met with a negative reaction. So Blizzard really hit the peak with the artifact weapon. Players liked it, Blizzard liked it, so it seemed like a no-brainer to try to do it again. Except there were some problems with the next iteration, and it kind of soured people to any kind of system similar to it. So basically, that's the short history of the borrowed power systems. No need to go into too much detail about all of them. Instead, let's talk about them in more broad terms. In order to do that, let's go back to glyphs. Section 2. Why glyphs failed. The glyph system was removed from the game. However, the talent system has stayed in the game since the beginning. Both of them were default ways to just adjust the power level of your character, and change how some of your main abilities worked. Why was one of them kept and the other one removed? Well, because talents are better. Talents are like a core part of your class, whereas glyphs are just kind of buffs to your class. There are entire specs and rotations which revolve around talent points, like Spirit Shell. The same could not really be said about glyphs. And another thing with glyphs, sure, they did change them up pretty much every expansion and the functionality of all of them. However, you didn't have to do anything to get those new glyphs. If you made a new character, you'd have to go out and buy every new glyph, sure. But if you played the same character for years, the new expansion meant you might have to visit the auction house in order to buy one glyph, and then you were done with the progression of your character through that system. Plus, keeping the glyphs in the game means they'd have to constantly balance them, and they already barely balance the talents between each other. So, therein lies the problem with the glyph system. If they wanted to add new things to the game, glyphs always have to be taken into consideration about whether they interact with things in unintended ways, and they're not a great system in order to add new things to, because it's entirely passive when you already have all of them. There's no reason for them to bother with them if talents can accomplish the same baseline goals, and instead they can spend that development time in new power systems that are much more fun to work with. Which leads into the next point. Section 3. Why do devs like to make borrowed power? Personally, I DM a lot of games for D&D, and being a dungeon master is like a very low-risk version of being a game designer. There's no point in changing the core mechanics of the game, but the core mechanics of the game allow you to add pretty much whatever you want on top of it. So there's a whole market for player-created items, enchants, boons, adventures, subclasses, maps, and new systems to add to the original ones. There are people who make a living doing nothing but creating homebrew content for D&D. Some of them with very profitable Patreons and Kickstarters. Even Crit's Metzen had one. And why is there such a huge market for just adding stuff to a game that already exists, where almost none of them change the core fundamental game itself? Well, because it's a lot of fun. I can tell you from personal experience that creating brand new abilities that you know are only going to be temporary, because they're not part of the base game, and you can just remove them when you run another game, just allows you to throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks. And in D&D, as a dungeon master, you can apply hotfixes to your game in real time as soon as they become a problem, because of just how tabletop role-playing games work. In video games, it's a little bit different, but what I'm trying to say is I can understand why the designers like the systems, but also as a player, I can see why people are sick of them. Think of it like this. You're a designer, and you just joined the WoW team, and you want to give, warlocks some new ridiculous ability, where they can sacrifice part of the health of all their demons in order to shoot a giant health bolt at your opponent. But if you want to add that to the game, you have to think, how would this interact with all the systems we have in the game currently? And how would it interact in the future when we add new stuff to the game? And would we have to limit the amount of demons we can allow warlocks to summon, and etc, etc? Well, you don't have to think about any of that if you just add it as a temporary power system. Say you want to let demon hunters spam their I-beam ability endlessly on mob packs. Sure, it's kind of broken, but it's also fun, and it's only temporary, so it's okay to be a little bit broken. From a designer's point of view, they just get to be more creative with what they want to add to the game, because they don't have to worry about the long-term health of the game. And honestly, I think people who play the game would be fine with this too, if it wasn't for the fact that they were so hard to obtain as well. Maxing out your artifact was a huge grind. Getting the super legendaries in Legion was almost impossible to target the ones you actually wanted. Azerite gear was needlessly complicated for how simple the system was. Corruptions were huge power increases, but they were so random that it completely ruined everything with them. The new legendary obtainment system for Shadowlands is a huge improvement over Legion, but they force you to run an optional game mode in order to get the currency required to create it, plus make maxing out the legendaries needlessly expensive. If they just allowed you to obtain all this stuff as easy as you could glyphs, or even tier set bonuses, I'm sure people would have a lot more fun with them too. It seems like a win-win situation. Developers get to have fun creating brand new abilities and spells, or things which upgrade class abilities, and players get to have fun with those and change them out however they want. So why doesn't Blizzard just give you all of these things easier? Section 4. Why must you work for power? Say you're playing a single-player RPG, and you can just buy all the gear and power you want from a vendor for free. in the starting zone. In this imagined scenario, there is no level requirement or restrictions on anything. You can just go crazy with it. With this, you would be able to easily beat the game at level 1 by just equipping all the most overpowered items and skill combinations. And this is also what we call playing a game with cheat codes turned on. There is some fun to playing a game with cheat codes, but generally, that's something which is more of a side enjoyment after you play the game normally. However, let's take this same exact scenario, and instead add in some restrictions to the gear, like say a minimum level requirement. Everything else is still the same. You would no longer be able to beat the game at level 1, but you would be able to beat the game once you got to the level which unlocked the most overpowered pieces of equipment. However, there would be more of a game to play. You have to go out and grind levels so you could eventually equip the strong stuff. And then equipping the strong stuff would feel more earned instead of just like you enter cheat codes. So that kind of raises the $1,000,000 question. What kind of restrictions should you add? With no restrictions, you're not really playing a game anymore and more of a power fantasy simulator. However, if you just take the same system, add level restrictions, and add some kind of cost to purchase those items, then it's universally accepted system, which is pretty standard in games. But if the cost for purchasing those items is waiting months for Titan Residuum that you can't do anything to farm faster, then it just adds a new problem. If the developers just give you the fun new toys for free, then it's kind of like the Glyph situation all over again, where you just log into a new expansion and you just kind of have all the new stuff, which means you finish the game that much quicker. However, if they add some hurdles in order to obtain the new power, then you get the nice old psychological feeling like you've earned it, and it can make it feel a lot better to play around with. That's kind of the core playback loop of MMOs in general, putting a little bit of work in order to obtain small rewards. One of the problems though, is usually the time and effort that you have to put in order to obtain these things is just tuned too high. In Legion BFA, you had to grind for weeks or months in order to get the max level in your artifact or azurite necklace. In order to get the best pieces of benthic gear, you had to farm mana pearls for a week in order to get the correct one that had the correct tertiary stat. And in Shadowlands, if you wish to pick a different Covenant ability, well, say goodbye to all the progress on the Soulbinds and Sanctums because you're going to have to go farm Renown for a week. If they just found some way to make these things less of a drag to interact with, I'm sure there wouldn't be as much negative sentiment towards them, although there would probably still be some. Section 5. Permanence versus temporary. There are regular things which change with every expansion that players are okay with. However, borrowed power systems are not one of them. If people could still use their artifact weapons today, I'm sure there'd be a lot less debate about borrowed power, although the game would also be ridiculous with the amount of abilities in it if we literally kept the artifact weapon, azurite necklaces, essences, corruptions on top of the Covenant abilities and soulbinds, even if that would be kind of fun in its own way. Blizzard can already barely balance talents between each other. Just look at this graph I have on screen. This talent is literally useless. I couldn't imagine the nightmare involved in balancing all the systems between each other. However, players regularly lose all the gear that they've worked hard for every new tier. When a new expansion comes out, it's kind of expected that some classes and specs will just be completely redesigned. And in fact, people clamor for Blizzard to change theirs next, or to just fix a problem they might have broken. All that to say, players are fine with some things going away or changing, but not okay with others. I think one of the biggest problems with the borrowed power system is just kind of a point of the previous section in this one. They make you work so hard in order to obtain this temporary power system, as there's so much that goes into them, that by the time the next expansion comes out, it kind of feels like a huge waste of time. At least with gear, once it drops, there's not much more to it. It's kind of a reward for doing high-level pieces of content. The borrowed power systems require you to engage with everything in the game for most of them. And in the act of being so involved in everything in order to grind them out, it kind of works against them in their very temporary status. I'm sure the people who ran island expeditions for days on end would like it if they could have something to show for it, which is why people are kind of fine with the exact same grinds being required for cosmetic items. Grinding out a mount back in Wrath of the Lich King provides you the same exact benefits today as it did back then. Same with pets and transmogs. A pet you level to 25 in Mist of Pandaria is still a max level pet today. And since they can't really make these systems permanent, what they could do is make them less of a chore to interact with. Part of the reason people are fine with tier set bonuses is because you don't have to run daily quests, dungeons, or farm rep to obtain them. You get them from raiding, and you can get them pretty quickly. which is why there's not as much attachment or sense of loss when they're gone. Section 6. Conclusion. Is the WoW community's borrowed power fatigue justified? I'd say absolutely so. Even with them heavily downplaying the amount of work that is required to interact with the modern power systems, there are still a lot of very annoying restrictions to them, like how punishing it is to swap covenants, when the abilities themselves are not even as impactful as some of the essences from the previous expansion, which you could change like talents, or how maxing out the item level of your legendary is ridiculously expensive. It leads people to think you have to buy WoW tokens in order to be competitive. Or how they ruined a fun minigame for players by forcing you to do it for legendary currency A and B. And I guess this is the point where I'd ask the audience a question. Would you be okay with borrowed power systems if they were just easier to interact with? Or have they completely ruined their own reputation and should just be removed from the game? Or maybe some third option? Because personally, I'm more inclined towards option number 1. Oh, and also,